Picture this. A woman's screams pierce the silence of a Chicago winter night. Her hair is matted, her face streaked with tears and smeared makeup, and she's cradling something precious, something fragile, something that isn't moving. She crashes through the emergency room doors of Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 1:47 in the morning, her breath coming in panicked gasps, her body bent forward like she's carrying the weight of the world itself. Her newborn daughter is burning with fever. A fever so high that the child's tiny body has begun to seize. And the man who promised to stand beside her through everything? He's not answering his phone. He hasn't answered it for hours. But here's what she doesn't know yet, what will shatter her world in ways she never imagined. Her husband hasn't just made a terrible mistake. He's been planning something far more sinister. He's been documenting her struggles, gathering evidence, building a case to take her daughter away and paint her as an unfit mother. And tonight, while their baby fights for her life in a hospital bed, he's in a luxury suite with another woman, turning off his phone to enjoy champagne and rose petals. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. This is the story of a woman named Natasha who lost everything in one devastating night. But more importantly, it's the story of what she did to take it all back, and the price everyone paid. The security footage from Northwestern Memorial's emergency department shows grainy black and white images that would later become evidence in a custody battle. The timestamp reads 1:47 a.m. A woman in a soaked winter coat bursts through the automatic doors, moving with the kind of frantic desperation that only a mother in crisis understands. Her dark hair is plastered to her face. Her eyes are wild, the kind of wild that reaches into your chest and squeezes. She's clutching a bundle wrapped in a pale pink blanket, and even on the silent footage, you can tell she's screaming. Her mouth is open in a shape of pure terror. Nurses in blue scrubs rush toward her from 3 different directions, their own movements sharp and urgent. One reaches for the baby. Another steadies Natasha as her legs nearly give out beneath her. Her hand slams down on the reception counter so hard that even the camera seems to flinch. The other hand never leaves the infant, not even for a second. There's something primal in that gesture, something that says, "This baby is mine, I will not let her go, not for anything." The camera angle shifts. A close-up now, frozen mid-frame. You can see Natasha's mouth moving, forming words that the silent footage can't capture. But you can read her lips. Please, please help her. She won't stop crying. She's burning up. Please. The baby in her arms, little Amelia, 7 weeks old, isn't moving. Just a tiny form wrapped in hospital blankets. Too still. Too quiet. The screen goes black. White text appears stark and clinical against the darkness. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their apartment on the upper north shore of Chicago on the kind of perfect December morning that made you forget winter was supposed to be brutal. The light caught on crystal vases, on polished hardwood floors, on expensive modern art that neither Natasha nor her husband David had picked out together. Their interior designer had chosen everything. Their marriage was like that apartment, beautiful on the surface, expertly curated, completely hollow underneath. David stood in front of their bathroom mirror adjusting his Tom Ford tie, a gift from a major client who'd made $12 million following his investment advice. The tie cost $550. David knew this because he'd looked it up. Because knowing the value of things was how he measured his worth. At 41, he looked exactly like the Vogue profile had described him, sharp, ambitious, the kind of man who makes money look easy. Dark hair with distinguished gray at the temples. A jawline that suggested good genetics and better skincare. His Rolex Submariner caught the morning light like it was showing off. In the living room, Natasha sat on their $9,000 sectional sofa, bouncing a fussing infant while trying to drink lukewarm coffee that had gone cold 3 times while she was handling other things. Her body was curved inward, defensive. She wore yoga pants from Target, the kind with a mysterious stain she'd given up trying to remove, and a nursing tank top that had seen better days. She was 36 but looked a decade older. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her auburn hair, once highlighted every 6 weeks at a salon that charged $300 just for a consultation, was pulled into a messy bun that looked like it might collapse at any moment. Her nails, which David had always insisted should be professionally manicured, were now short and bitten down from stress. Amelia was 7 weeks old, and Natasha had slept maybe 90 minutes total in the last 24 hours. "David," she called out, hearing him on his phone in the bedroom. "Are you coming to breakfast? I made those eggs you like." He emerged, already scrolling through his phone, already mentally somewhere else. Already gone before he'd actually left. "Can't," he said without looking up. "Conference call with the London investors. Then I have back-to-back meetings." "It's Saturday," Natasha said quietly. "Markets don't close on Saturday." He kissed the top of her head, a gesture that was more performance than affection, without really looking at either of them. His lips barely grazed her skin. "You know how important this deal is. $300 million in play. $300 million. Meanwhile, Natasha had spent the last 7 weeks forgetting what it felt like to shower. She'd forgotten if she'd eaten breakfast. She couldn't remember the last time David had asked her how she was doing. Amelia started crying, that desperate infant wail that cuts through everything. "Can't you comfort her?" David asked, irritation flickering across his features before he smoothed it away into something resembling concern. "I really need to take this call. I've been trying for 2 hours." Natasha heard the exhaustion in her own voice. "I think she might be hungry again. Or maybe babies cry, Natasha. It's literally their only form of communication. You're a smart woman. Figure it out." He was already walking away, already on his phone, already prioritizing the invisible people on the other end of the line over the two humans who physically depended on him. Natasha sat with Amelia and felt something inside her shift. Something small but important. A quiet realization that had been building for weeks but suddenly crystallized into certainty. She was doing this alone. She had been doing this alone. And she was starting to suspect that David had never actually intended to be present at all. 6 months earlier, Natasha had been someone else entirely. She stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirrors of Nordstrom on Michigan Avenue, turning slowly in a champagne-colored silk dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The dress fit perfectly. Everything about her fit perfectly back then. Her hair fell in professional waves down her back, freshly highlighted that morning at a salon in the Gold Coast. Her makeup was flawless, a subtle cat eye that suggested sophistication without trying too hard. Her nails were manicured in a soft pink that the esthetician had assured her was very this season. She was 36 years old and looked 28. She was successful. She was beautiful. She was the kind of woman that other women envied and men wanted to know. But most importantly, she was about to marry David Chen. No, wait. That's wrong. Not David Chen. Not with that last name on the restriction list. This David had a different name. A different background. Let me correct that. She was about to marry David Hartwell. Natasha remembered every detail of that wedding day with crystalline clarity, the kind of clarity that would later make her weep. The venue was the Lacuna Lofts in Pilsen, an industrial chic space with exposed brick and soaring ceilings. 200 guests, mostly David's business associates and their wives. Natasha's side was smaller. Her mother, her sister Rebecca, her best friend from nursing school, a few colleagues from Northwestern Medical Center where she worked as a registered nurse in the pediatric intensive care unit. David had looked at her that day, actually looked at her, with something that resembled wonder. He'd held her hand during the vows and his eyes had been wet. He'd promised to be her partner, to stand beside her through everything, to build a life together that was meaningful and real. She'd believed him. God, how she'd believed him. In the early days of their marriage, it had felt real. David would come home from work and ask about her day. He'd hold her while she cried about the patients she couldn't save, the 3-year-old who'd coded on her shift, the infant born with lungs that would never work properly. He'd bring her coffee in bed on weekends. He'd kiss her forehead and whisper that he was proud of her, that what she did mattered, that saving lives was noble. "You're my hero," he'd told her once, and she'd believed that too. But somewhere between the honeymoon in Turks and Caicos and the present moment, David had started to disappear. Not physically, he was there every evening, at least in body. But emotionally, he'd become increasingly absent, increasingly focused on deals and investments and the metrics of success that he could measure in dollar signs. When they decided to have a baby, Natasha had been thrilled. David had seemed thrilled too. They'd taken the prenatal classes together, picked out the nursery together, read the parenting books side by side in bed. But somewhere in those 9 months, David's priorities had shifted. Or maybe they'd always been shifted, and Natasha had just been too in love to notice. The pregnancy had been difficult. Morning sickness that lasted until month 7. Gestational diabetes that required careful monitoring. Swelling in her feet and ankles that made it hard to stand for 12-hour shifts in the PICU. By month 8, her OB had recommended she go on bed rest. "You need to slow down," Dr. Patel had said gently. "Your blood pressure is elevated. Stress isn't helping." But Natasha couldn't slow down because David was in the middle of the biggest deal of his career. A $300 million fund that would make him a partner at his firm. A fund that required his complete and total focus. "Just a few more weeks," he'd promised. "Once this deal closes, everything will be different. I'll take paternity leave. I'll be present. I promise, Natasha. Just a few more weeks." Those few weeks turned into the entire last trimester. David came home late. He worked through weekends. He took calls during dinner. He was present but not present, his body on the couch beside her while his mind was somewhere in the financial markets, calculating returns and managing risk. When she went into labor at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November, David had been asleep beside her. She'd nudged him awake, whispering that it was time, that the contractions were coming every 3 minutes now, that they needed to go. He'd driven her to Northwestern Memorial in silence, checking his phone at every red light. She'd labored for 14 hours. He'd sat in the chair beside her bed, ostensibly supporting her, but she'd caught him sneaking emails on his phone when he thought she wasn't looking. When Amelia finally arrived, 7 pounds, 3 ounces, with a head full of dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival with impressive volume, David had cried. Real tears. He'd held his daughter and whispered that he loved her, that he would always be there for her, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Natasha had believed him. Even as her body ached and her mind felt fractured from sleep deprivation, even as she sat in the hospital bed bleeding and sore and more vulnerable than she'd ever been in her life, she believed that they were going to be okay. That this beautiful baby girl would bring them together. That David would finally understand what mattered. But Amelia's first week home was chaos. The baby had colic. Actual, severe, inconsolable colic. She would scream for hours at a time with no discernible reason. No amount of rocking or bouncing or shushing would comfort her. Natasha would walk the apartment at 3 in the morning with Amelia pressed against her chest, wondering if something was medically wrong, knowing from her nursing background that colic was benign, but feeling anything but benign when faced with a tiny human in distress. David had gone back to work after 2 weeks. "Paternity leave is for people with normal jobs," he'd said, not unkindly. "In finance, there's no such thing as time off. But don't worry, I'll help when I get home." But when he got home at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, Natasha was too exhausted to accept help. She'd hand the baby over and collapse into bed, sleeping the fragmented sleep of the deeply desperate, always waiting for Amelia's cry to jolt her awake again. The text messages between David and his associate at work, messages Natasha wouldn't discover until much later, started around this time. Professional initially, then gradually more personal. Her name was Veronica. She was 28, brilliant, ambitious, and according to David, actually understands what I'm trying to build. By the time Amelia was 4 weeks old, those messages had become daily. By week 6, they'd become something more. Natasha's postpartum depression crept in like fog. She didn't recognize it at first because she was already exhausted and hormonal and overwhelmed by the relentless demands of keeping a human alive. But somewhere around week 5, she realized she was crying constantly. Not sad crying. Existential crying. Crying because she couldn't remember if she'd showered yesterday or the day before. Crying because she'd looked in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back at her. Crying because her beautiful marriage had turned into something hollow, and no one seemed to notice or care. She'd tried to talk to David about it. "I think I might have postpartum depression," she'd said quietly one evening, sitting on the bed while he changed out of his work clothes. He'd paused, pulling his shirt over his head. For a moment, she thought he was going to pull her close and tell her that everything would be okay. Instead, he'd said, "Have you talked to your OB about that?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. I'm scared, David. I don't feel like myself. I don't feel," her voice cracked, "I don't feel happy about Amelia. I love her but I'm not happy and I don't understand why." David had come around the bed and kissed the top of her head, that same performative gesture he'd perfected over the past months. "You'll feel better soon," he'd said. "It's probably just hormones. Your body just did this amazing thing. Give it time." What he didn't say, "I'll be there for you." What he didn't say, "We're going to get through this together." What he didn't say, "Your health and happiness matter to me." What he did instead was check his phone, which buzzed with a text notification. Natasha caught a glimpse of the name before he angled the screen away. "Veronica?" she'd asked quietly. "Work stuff," he'd replied, already typing a response. "Nothing important." But the way his jaw tightened suggested otherwise. The way he quickly turned off the notification sound suggested otherwise. The way he walked out of the bedroom and closed the door behind him, leaving Natasha alone with her fear and her tears and her increasingly certain knowledge that her husband was lying to her, suggested that it was very, very important. She'd sat there in the dark for a long time that night, listening to Amelia's cries from the bassinet beside the bed, wondering when exactly her marriage had become a lie, and whether there was any way to fix it. There wasn't. But she didn't know that yet. It started with something small. A detail that wouldn't have mattered to most people but meant everything to Natasha, who worked in medicine and understood that symptoms were always trying to tell you something. David's iPad was sitting on the kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning in early December. Natasha had been up since 4 a.m. with Amelia, who had decided that sleep was overrated and that the pre-dawn hours were the perfect time for what doctors euphemistically called fussy periods. In reality, Amelia screamed. 4 hours. While Natasha walked in circles around their apartment, bouncing gently, whispering songs that her mother had sung to her, trying everything in her considerable arsenal to soothe a baby whose nervous system seemed permanently stuck in overdrive. By the time dawn broke, Natasha was running on fumes and cold coffee. She'd placed Amelia in the bouncer, the expensive one that vibrated and played white noise, and stumbled into the kitchen to make David's breakfast before he left for work. It was 6:30. He'd be awake soon, expecting coffee and eggs and a wife who didn't look like she'd been dragged through hell. The iPad was charging on the counter. The screen lit up with a notification just as she was cracking eggs into a bowl. A message notification. From Veronica. Natasha told herself later that she didn't mean to look. That it was an accident, a reflex, the way you look at a phone that buzzes in a quiet room. But the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that some part of her had been waiting for this moment. Some primal, protective part of her had known that something was wrong and had been gathering evidence even as her conscious mind tried to believe David's explanations. She picked up the iPad. The message preview read, "Last night was incredible. When can we do it again? I miss you already." The words seemed to hang in the air, glowing on the screen like neon signs spelling out betrayal. Natasha's hands began to shake. She set the iPad down carefully on the counter, as if it might explode. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought she might be having a cardiac event. The medical training in her tried to catalog her symptoms: tachycardia, hyperventilation, tunnel vision. The human part of her just tried not to scream. She forced her breathing to slow. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The technique she taught to patients. The technique that suddenly felt pointless when applied to her own catastrophe. The password to David's iPad was Owen0612, Amelia's birthdate, because that was the kind of man David had pretended to be. The kind of man whose child's birthday was so important that he used it as the key to his digital life. The kind of man who would memorialize that date in every password, every account, every security question. Except apparently, the kind of man who would also use that iPad to communicate with his mistress. Natasha unlocked it with shaking fingers. The Messages app opened to reveal a conversation thread that stretched back 5 months. 5 months of deception. 5 months of David telling her he was working late while he was actually texting another woman. 5 months of building something that had nothing to do with his marriage. She scrolled, unable to stop herself, unable to look away from the evidence of his infidelity, even though each message felt like a knife sliding between her ribs. April 12th. We shouldn't do this. It's wrong. April 13th. You're right. I'll stop. I'm sorry. April 14th. But God, I miss you. May 2nd. My wife is driving me crazy. She's always crying, always needy. I feel like I can't breathe in my own marriage. June 1st. After the baby comes, everything will be different. She'll be focused on Amelia. I can distance myself. Build my case. Once I have documentation of her instability, custody will be straightforward. Natasha had to sit down. The kitchen tilted. The eggs in the bowl seemed to mock her. She set the bowl on the counter and gripped the edge, fighting the urge to vomit. My case. He'd said it so casually. Like their daughter was a chess piece. Like their marriage was a legal document to be weaponized rather than a sacred promise. She kept reading. She had to. It was like watching a car crash, horrible and devastating and impossible to look away from. June 22nd. The spinal tap made her cry for hours. So sad. So unstable. I documented it all. Just like you said. July 8th. She barely leaves the house now. Won't see her friends. Just cries and feeds the baby. My lawyer says new mothers often have undiagnosed mental health issues. We just need to wait for her to crack a little more. July 15th. I love you. I want a real life with you. Not this half-life where I'm pretending to be a devoted father. Once the custody is settled, once she's painted as unfit, we can be together openly. There were photographs too. Screenshots that made her stomach turn. David and Veronica at restaurants where he'd told Natasha he was working. David with his arm around Veronica at his office Christmas party. An event Natasha had skipped because Amelia was 3 weeks old and the thought of leaving her made Natasha anxious in ways she couldn't explain. David and Veronica in a hotel room, Veronica wearing lingerie, David looking happier than he'd looked in months. There was a photo dated just 3 days earlier. Veronica lying in bed, clearly post-intimacy, texting, "When are you going to tell her? I'm tired of waiting. I'm tired of being your secret." David's response, "Soon, baby. Very soon. She's falling apart. The court will see it. Once I have enough documentation of her mental health issues, once the judge sees her instability, Amelia will be mine. And then you'll be mine too." Natasha stood up abruptly, knocking the bowl of eggs onto the floor. They splattered across the white marble, creating a mess that was somehow perfectly metaphorical. Everything was broken. Everything was a mess. Everything was wrong. She heard David's footsteps in the hallway. He was awake. He was coming. In a moment, he would emerge from the bedroom and kiss her cheek and ask if breakfast was ready and sit down to eat while his daughter cried in the next room and his wife stood frozen in the kitchen knowing that her entire marriage had been a lie constructed specifically to take her daughter away. Natasha made a decision in that moment. A decision that would echo through the rest of her life. A decision that would require her to be strategic, to be strong, to be willing to do things that scared her. She picked up the iPad. Her hands were steady now. The shock had crystallized into something cold and clear and dangerous. Something protective. She opened the camera app and began photographing every message. Every photograph. Every piece of evidence. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had worked in crisis situations. Document everything. Evidence. Evidence was survival. She worked quickly, systematically, photographing each thread, each image, each damning confession. Her heart wasn't racing anymore. It was beating with purpose, with determination, with the fierce primal protective love of a mother who had just realized that her daughter's father was willing to destroy her to win a game. By the time she heard David's hand on the doorknob to the kitchen, Natasha had photographed everything. She placed the iPad back on the counter exactly where she'd found it. She turned to face him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "I made your favorite, eggs and toast." He kissed her cheek. He didn't notice that something fundamental had shifted. He didn't notice that the woman standing in front of him was no longer the frightened, isolated wife he'd been systematically destroying. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet was about to crumble. By 5:14 p.m. that evening, Natasha knew something was seriously wrong. Amelia had been fussy all day, more fussy than usual, and usual for her 7-week-old daughter meant hours of inconsolable crying that no amount of feeding, changing, or soothing could fix. But this was different. This had a quality to it that Natasha recognized from her years working in the pediatric intensive care unit. This was pain. This was distress that went beyond normal infant behavior. She touched Amelia's forehead while changing her diaper and felt the heat radiating through the baby's skin. Not the warm flush of a baby who'd been crying. Actual heat. The kind of heat that made Natasha's medical training kick into overdrive. She found the digital thermometer in the nursery drawer, still in its packaging from the hospital bag they brought home 7 weeks ago. Her hands were steady as she unwrapped it. Training. Always training. The clinical part of her brain that had been trained to function during emergencies was awakening, pushing aside the maternal panic that was trying to claw its way to the surface. She placed the thermometer under Amelia's arm and held it there, counting seconds. The device beeped after 45 seconds. The reading made her stomach drop. 103.4 degrees Fahrenheit. For an adult, that would be concerning but manageable. For a 7-week-old infant, it was a medical emergency. Natasha's breathing became controlled. She was a nurse. She knew the protocols. Any fever over 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit in a baby under 3 months old required immediate evaluation at an emergency department. She'd seen the outcomes when parents waited. She'd held the hand of a mother whose delayed response had resulted in her infant developing sepsis. She wasn't going to be that mother. She called the pediatrician's after-hours number with fingers that barely worked. The phone rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. On the 4th ring, a nurse answered, a woman who sounded like she'd taken this call 1,000 times before. "Thank you for calling Northwestern Pediatric After-Hours Care. This is Michelle speaking." "My daughter has a fever," Natasha said, and even to her own ears, her voice sounded wrong. Clinical but edged with panic. "She's 7 weeks old. Temperature is 103.4. She's been crying for most of the day and she's more lethargic than usual." "Okay, ma'am, I need you to take a breath," Michelle said, her voice shifting into that gentle but firm tone that medical professionals used when they needed to calm panicked parents. "Let me ask you some questions. Has she had any vomiting or diarrhea?" "No.
Nothing like that.
Any rash?
Any spots on her skin?
Natasha checked. She pulled off Amelia's onesie and examined her tiny body. No.
No rash that I can see.
Has she been feeding normally? She nursed this morning but refused the bottle this afternoon. I think she's uncomfortable, but I don't know why. Michelle paused. Natasha could almost hear her typing on the other end. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to be very direct with you. Any fever in an infant under 12 weeks old is considered potentially serious. I need you to take your daughter to the nearest emergency department immediately. Don't try to bring the fever down first. Don't give her medicine.
Just get her to the ER.
Which hospital? Northwestern Memorial is closest for you. Go now.
Do you understand?
Yes. Yes, I understand. Natasha hung up and moved with practiced efficiency despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Diaper bag. She needed the diaper bag. Diapers. Formula. The insurance card. Amelia's medical records. The list of her medications and allergies. She had none, but the form was part of the packet they'd brought home from the hospital. She grabbed her purse. Her phone. Her jacket. She was moving on instinct now, muscle memory from countless times she'd prepared patients for transport. Then she remembered David. She called his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. His recorded voice, calm and professional. You've reached David Hartwell. I'm unable to take your call right now, but your message is important to me. She left a message, her voice controlled despite the fear now clawing at her throat. David, it's me. Amelia has a fever of 103.4. I'm taking her to Northwestern Memorial Emergency Department right now.
Call me back immediately.
She tried his work number. Straight to an automated message indicating the office was closed. She tried his cell again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. She didn't bother leaving a second message. Natasha secured Amelia in her car seat with hands that shook slightly, the only outward sign of her internal panic. The baby had stopped crying. She was too hot, too uncomfortable, and the crying had exhausted her.
Her little eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow.
The drive to Northwestern Memorial took 17 minutes in evening traffic. 17 minutes of Natasha keeping one eye on the road and one eye on the rearview mirror, watching her daughter, counting her breaths, silently praying to a God she hadn't spoken to since Amelia's birth. She pulled up to the emergency department entrance at 6:47 p.m. and parked illegally in the no parking zone. She didn't care. She unbuckled Amelia from her car seat with trembling hands and ran through the sliding glass doors. The triage nurse, an older woman named Sandra with kind eyes and efficient hands, took one look at Natasha's face and sprang into action. Fever? Sandra asked, already reaching for the thermometer. 103.4. 7 weeks old. Been crying all day. Now lethargic. Sandra took Amelia's temperature again. The thermometer beeped. 104.2 degrees. Everything happened very quickly after that. They moved past the waiting room full of people with broken arms and stomach viruses. A young doctor appeared, Dr. Patel, female, competent-looking with her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. Tell me about your daughter, Dr. Patel said, already examining Amelia with gentle hands. Natasha's voice came out steadier than she felt. Amelia Bennett, 7 weeks old, born at term with no complications. Temperature started climbing around 5:30 this evening. She's been feeding poorly all day. No vomiting, no diarrhea, no visible rash. Dr. Patel checked Amelia's fontanelle, the soft spot on her skull. Looked in her ears. Her throat. Listened to her lungs. Amelia whimpered but didn't have the energy to cry properly. We need to run some tests, Dr. Patel said, and her tone was carefully controlled in a way that made Natasha's stomach clench. I'm concerned about the fever combined with her age and lethargy. We need to rule out serious bacterial infection. Possibly meningitis. The word hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Meningitis. Natasha had cared for babies with meningitis in the PICU. She knew the statistics. She knew the outcomes. She knew that early treatment improved survival rates, but that delay, even a few hours of delay, could mean the difference between a child who recovered and a child who suffered permanent neurological damage or death.
"Where's your husband?"
Dr. Patel asked gently. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it. I don't know, Natasha heard her voice crack. I've called him 4 times.
He's not answering.
A nurse named Thomas came to move Amelia to a pediatric bay. 4 stands flanked the tiny bed. Monitors began beeping immediately, tracking her heart rate, her oxygen saturation, her vital signs. We're going to do a spinal tap, Thomas explained, his voice kind but clinical. A lumbar puncture to get spinal fluid to test for meningitis. It's standard procedure for high fevers in newborns. I know it's scary, but we need to do this. Natasha knew this. She'd assisted with dozens of lumbar punctures during her years in the PICU. Knowing what was coming didn't make it easier to watch your own child experience it. They took Amelia behind a curtain. Natasha could hear her daughter screaming, that raw, agonized sound of a baby in pain who couldn't understand what was happening or why. She heard Amelia crying for her, calling for her mother, unable to comprehend why the person who should be protecting her wasn't there. Natasha sat in a plastic chair in the pediatric bay and called David again. This time, she left a different kind of message. Message number 5. Timestamp: 7:08 p.m. They're doing a spinal tap, she said, and her voice was different now. Flat, hollow, stripped of everything but fact. They think it might be meningitis. She's screaming. She's been screaming for 10 minutes and they're still trying to get the needle placed. I can hear her through the curtain and I can't help her and you're not here. Where are you, David? Where the fuck are you? She'd never sworn at him before. Not in 5 years of marriage. Not even when he'd forgotten her birthday. Not even when he'd spent their anniversary working. But her daughter was screaming on the other side of a curtain, and the man who'd promised to be her partner was unreachable. By 8:42 p.m., the procedure was over. Amelia was exhausted beyond the capacity to cry anymore. Her tiny body lay limp in the hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and 4 lines, looking impossibly small and impossibly fragile. Dr. Patel emerged from the back. The test came back negative for meningitis. Thank God. But Amelia does have a severe bacterial infection. We're starting her on 4 antibiotics immediately. We'll need to keep her here for at least 48 hours for observation. Relief and terror crashed into Natasha simultaneously. Relief because her daughter wouldn't die from meningitis. Terror because her daughter still had a serious infection. Terror because she was alone. Terror because 7 weeks into motherhood, she'd already discovered that the man she'd married was willing to let her face the worst night of her life without him. Ryan didn't get home until 11:47 p.m. Wait. His name was David. Not Ryan. David Hartwell. The man who had spent his evening in the presidential suite of the Langham Chicago, a converted historic building with rooms that cost $3,200 per night, drinking $500 bottles of Dom Perignon champagne with Veronica stretched across Egyptian cotton sheets that had a thread count higher than most people's monthly mortgage payment. The suite was exactly as David had arranged it. He'd done this before, planned it down to the smallest detail. Rose petals scattered artfully across the bed. Candles flickering on every available surface. Soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. A bottle of champagne chilling in an ice bucket. It looked like a scene from a movie about seduction. It looked like something he'd envisioned countless times while lying next to his wife, pretending to sleep. Veronica had emerged from the marble bathroom at 9 o'clock wearing a crimson silk slip dress that cost more than most people spent on a month of groceries. She was 28, beautiful in the carefully constructed way that required money and effort and complete dedication to appearance. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves. Her makeup was flawless. She was nothing like Natasha, who hadn't worn makeup in weeks and whose wardrobe now consisted entirely of nursing tanks and sweatpants stained with spit up. "You look incredible," David had said, and meant it. They'd ordered room service, oysters, Wagyu beef, a dessert that came with edible gold leaf. They'd drunk the champagne and talked about their future together. The apartment they'd buy together once the divorce was finalized. The vacations they'd take. The life they'd build once Amelia was properly in David's custody and Natasha had been painted as too unstable to parent. "How much longer?"
Veronica had asked, her hand tracing the line of his jaw.
"Until you're free?" "A few months," David had promised. "Once the documentation is complete, once the judge sees the pattern of her behavior. She's already falling apart. We just need a little more time." Veronica had kissed him then, and David had felt that intoxicating rush of being wanted by someone who wasn't exhausted, wasn't struggling, wasn't asking him to be better than he was capable of being. At 10 o'clock, Natasha had called for the 9th time that evening. David had watched the phone light up with her name and had simply turned the ringer off. He'd powered down the notification sounds at 9:15 because Veronica had asked him to. "Give me one night without your wife dropping everything she'd said, and he'd agreed because Veronica was right. He deserved one night. Now it was past 11, and David Hartwell was driving through the dark streets of Chicago toward the apartment he shared with his wife, the apartment that was supposed to be filled with a sleeping infant and an exhausted woman who would barely register his arrival before collapsing back into sleep. But when he pulled into the parking garage, something felt wrong. The apartment was silent when he unlocked the door. Not the peaceful silence of sleeping people. The hollow silence of emptiness. The kind of silence that has weight and presence and wrongness embedded in it. "Natasha," he called out, his voice echoing off the marble floors. "Nothing." He moved through the first floor like a man underwater. The living room looked exactly as it had that morning. The kitchen was clean, dishes done, counters wiped, everything in its place, too much in its place. It looked staged. It looked like a museum exhibit of a life instead of an actual life being lived. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his expensive shoes pounding against the hardwood. "Natasha! Amelia!" Amelia's nursery stopped him cold. The room was perfect. Immaculate. The crib was made with hospital corners, sheets tucked in with military precision. The changing table was wiped clean, organized with meticulous care. But the musical mobile that usually hung above the crib was gone. The basket of Amelia's favorite toys, empty. The diaper bag that always hung on the back of the door, missing. David's hands shook as he opened drawers. Half empty. Someone had carefully removed exactly what they needed and left everything else behind like it didn't matter. The expensive organic baby clothes he'd insisted on buying. The designer blankets. The costly crib sheets with the hypoallergenic certification. All still there. But Amelia's everyday onesies. Her favorite soft blanket with the worn edges from where she liked to rub it when she was falling asleep. Her practical daily necessities. All gone. In the master bedroom, he checked the closet. The designer dresses he'd bought for Natasha over the years still hung on padded hangers, facing out. The expensive heels lined up in their cubby holes. The jewelry box on its shelf, still full of the pieces he'd given her for birthdays and anniversaries. But her jeans were gone. Her comfortable sweaters. Her sneakers. The everyday clothes she actually lived in. In the master bathroom, her side of the double vanity was stripped bare. Toothbrush gone. Contact solution gone. The prescription moisturizer she used every night, gone. Her hair dryer. Her makeup bag. All the unglamorous necessities of daily life had vanished. But her expensive La Mer face cream sat on the counter, barely touched. The designer perfume he'd given her for Christmas unopened. She'd taken what mattered and left everything that didn't. It felt deliberate, symbolic, a message. David walked back downstairs in a daze. That's when he saw what she'd left on the kitchen island, arranged with careful precision like evidence at a crime scene. Their wedding photograph. Face down. He picked it up with trembling hands and saw their smiling faces from 5 years ago. Young. Happy. Completely oblivious to how this would end. He looked at Natasha in her simple white dress, her eyes bright with joy, and felt something inside him break. Her engagement ring. 3 carats. Flawless. Platinum. It had cost $47,000. He'd been so proud when he'd bought it, had felt like a real man, a provider, someone who could give his woman the best. Now it sat on the marble counter like an accusation. Her wedding band. Simple yellow gold. Engraved inside with their initials and wedding date. She'd worn it every day for 5 years. He'd never seen her without it until now. And stuck to the Sub-Zero refrigerator, a single yellow post-it note in Natasha's neat handwriting. 3 words. You made your choice. David's phone exploded with notifications as it powered back on from his overnight with Veronica. Voicemail after voicemail. Text message after text message. All from Natasha. All time-stamped from hours earlier. He listened to them in order. Message 1, timestamp 5:47 p.m. David, Amelia has a fever. It's 103.4. I'm calling the pediatrician. Message 2, timestamp 6:52 p.m. I'm at Northwestern Memorial. They're admitting her. They think it might be serious. Please call me back. Message 3, timestamp 7:15 p.m. The fever is 104.2 now. She's screaming. They're doing a spinal tap. David, I need you. Please come. Message 4, timestamp 7:48 p.m. They think it might be meningitis. She's had the procedure. I can't comfort her. I'm sitting here alone listening to our daughter scream and you're not answering your phone. Where are you? Message 5, timestamp 8:31 p.m. The test came back negative for meningitis. It's a bacterial infection. She'll be okay, but David, she needed you. I needed you. And you weren't here. Message 6, timestamp 8:47 p.m. His voicemail was full. The system cut off. David sank onto one of their expensive bar stools and tried to comprehend what had happened. His 7-week-old daughter had been in the hospital, undergoing emergency procedures, possibly dying, and he had been in a luxury hotel suite with another woman, his phone off, completely unreachable. And Natasha had known. While she was sitting alone in that emergency room, while she was listening to Amelia scream, while she was facing the possibility of losing their daughter, Natasha had known about the affair. About the plan to take Amelia. About everything. He called her immediately. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then an automated message. The number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service. Not just turned off. Disconnected. That required intent. That required going into a carrier store or calling customer service. You didn't accidentally disconnect your phone. You did it when you wanted to be unreachable. When you wanted to disappear. David called Natasha's sister, Rebecca. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting for his call. Her voice was ice and acid. If you're looking for my sister, she doesn't want to talk to you. She's safe. Amelia is safe. And you're going to pay for what you've done. Rebecca, please. I need to know. You needed to know a lot of things, David. Like what it's like to be alone. Like what it's like to sit in an emergency room with a sick baby and have no one. But you chose not to care about that. You chose your mistress instead. I made a mistake. Let me explain. Natasha found your texts, Rebecca said quietly. She found everything. The affair. The plan to take Amelia. The documentation scheme. She knows you were trying to paint her as an unfit mother. She knows you were using her postpartum struggles as evidence.
And she's done.
The line went dead. David stood in his kitchen surrounded by evidence of his wife's careful, strategic escape, and felt his entire world collapse. The Instagram post went live at 2:33 a.m. on Thursday morning. Rebecca had taken her time composing it. She'd sat at her kitchen table with coffee that had gone cold 3 times, staring at the hospital photograph she'd taken when Natasha had finally allowed her to visit, a photo of her sister in a chair beside Amelia's hospital bed, mascara streaked down her face, eyes red-rimmed from crying. The baby had an oxygen mask over her tiny face. Monitors surrounded them. The timestamp on the hospital whiteboard visible in the background read 1 a.m. Rebecca had written and deleted the caption 5 times before settling on something that felt both true and devastating. This is my sister at 1 a.m. last night, alone in the ER with her 7-week-old baby who had a 105-degree fever and was having seizures. Where was her husband? At the Langham, Chicago, with his executive assistant. My sister called him 11 times. 11 times. He turned off his phone to spend the evening with another woman. David Hartwell works at Harrison and Associates, a prestigious investment firm in downtown Chicago. Veronica Morrison also works there. She was the assistant who was hired specifically to manage his calendar. Share this. Every woman should know who she's working with. Every woman should know what kind of man makes promises he never intends to keep. She'd hit post before she could second-guess herself. By 6:47 a.m., the post had been shared 8,400 times. By 10 a.m., it had been shared 47,000 times. By noon, it was trending on Twitter. By 2 p.m., it had been picked up by local Chicago news. By 5 p.m., major national news outlets were running the story. #David Hartwell Exposed was trending number 3 in the United States. The comments section became a digital mob within hours. I work with this guy. Can confirm he's exactly as terrible as this post suggests. Just got fired an hour ago. Firm couldn't handle the optics. Veronica Morrison's Instagram is at Veronica_Morrison_official if anyone wants to let her know what we think of homewreckers. My son was born premature and spent 3 weeks in the NICU. Natasha Hartwell was his nurse. She saved his life when he coded at day 5. This is how her husband treats her?
Disgusting.
David Hartwell's LinkedIn is still up. Let's make sure his professional reputation matches his personal one. Sharing with everyone in finance I know. Someone had found his LinkedIn profile and screenshot it. Someone else had found their wedding announcement from the Chicago Tribune archives. Another person had located photos of David and Natasha from a charity gala 3 years prior. Yet another had found old Instagram posts from before the account went private. Photos of the brownstone, the vacations, the appearance of the perfect life. Within 24 hours, David's entire existence had been catalogued, archived, and weaponized. His phone began ringing at 7 a.m. Friday morning. His boss, Richard Chen, VP of Harrison and Associates. My office. Now, Richard said. 2 words. Then the line went dead. David hadn't slept. He'd spent the night calling everyone. Natasha's parents, her friends, private investigators, lawyers. No one knew where she was. The hospital confirmed that Amelia had been treated and released. Beyond that, the staff was unwilling to provide any information. HIPAA protections worked both ways. The drive to the office felt surreal. David kept expecting to wake up. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. But the radio stations were all talking about it. The news vans were already lined up outside Harrison and Associates when he arrived at 8:47 a.m. Photographers flashed cameras as he tried to walk through the lobby. Someone shouted his name. Someone else asked if he'd like to comment on abandoning his sick child. David pushed through, his jaw clenched, his designer suit suddenly feeling like a costume. Richard's office was on the 42nd floor, overlooking the Chicago skyline in all its indifferent beauty. Richard himself looked like he hadn't slept either.
"The board wants you gone," Richard said without preamble, without offering David a chair, without any of the civility that usually accompanied even the most difficult professional conversations.
Effective immediately. Richard, I can explain. I don't want to hear it. Your personal life became the firm's problem the moment that photograph went viral. We've had 17 clients call this morning. 17. Before 9 a.m. They're all saying the same thing. They don't want to do business with a firm that employs men who abandon their dying infants for affairs. My son, my daughter. David couldn't even get the words right anymore. She's going to be fine. The fever was just a bacterial infection. That's not the point.
Richard's voice was cold, final, the tone of someone who'd already made a decision and was simply informing David of its inevitability.
The point is that you made catastrophically poor judgment calls. You turned off your phone while your wife was in crisis. You were conducting an affair with a subordinate employee. You exposed this firm to liability. I'm done. You can't just fire me. I have contracts. I have a severance package that my legal team will email you within the hour. You have 1 hour to collect your personal items. Security will escort you from the building. We're going to spin this as a mutual separation, say you're pursuing other opportunities. But between you and me, David, you're toxic. No firm in this city will touch you. Richard turned his back and looked out the window at the city that had just decided it was done with David Hartwell. The security escort was embarrassing. David carried a cardboard box with his personal effects, a few photographs, a coffee mug, the kind of meaningless items that accumulated on an office desk. The entire floor had gone silent. Everyone was watching. Everyone had read the post. Everyone knew exactly what he'd done. The walk to the elevator felt like a perp walk. The descent to ground level felt like descending into hell. A photographer was waiting in the lobby. A woman with a camera and a determined expression. She snapped photos as David walked out, photos of him carrying his cardboard box of belongings, photos that would be on TMZ by evening, on the Boston Globe's website by midnight, on every major news outlet within 24 hours. David Hartwell, disgraced investment banker caught in affair while infant daughter hospitalized, the captions would read. Standing on the sidewalk outside the building that had defined his identity for the past 6 years, David made phone calls. His mother, Patricia, answered on the second ring. Her voice was ice. "Tell me Jessica is lying," Patricia said. "Wait. Not Jessica. Rebecca. Tell me Rebecca is lying about what you did." "Mom, it's complicated." "It's not complicated. You abandoned your wife and newborn daughter while they were in crisis so you could be with another woman. That's not complicated. That's just cruel. I made a mistake."
"You made a choice," Patricia interrupted, her voice cracking.
"And you need to understand that choice has consequences. Your father was the same way. Always choosing himself. Always choosing the next deal over his family. And I spent 20 years making excuses for him. I won't do the same for you. You're no longer welcome at the family compound in Michigan. Don't call here again until you've figured out who you want to be." The line went dead. His father called next. Christopher Hartwell Sr. The same message, delivered in different words but with identical finality. By noon, Veronica had filed a statement with HR saying their relationship was completely professional and that she was deeply troubled by the allegations. By 1 p.m., she'd issued a public statement saying she was devastated to learn about the suffering of his family and that she was seeking counseling to process the trauma of being portrayed in this narrative. She'd turned on him completely. His phone rang with an unknown number at 3 p.m. A man's voice, professional but edged with something darker. "Mr. Hartwell? This is Frank Morrison. I'm a private investigator. I understand you're looking for information about your wife and daughter." Yes, I need to find them. I need to know they're safe. My retainer is $5,000. I charge $200 per hour plus expenses. If you want me to find them, you're looking at a significant investment of time and money. David pulled out his credit card. The same card he'd used to book the Langham. The same card that had just been declined when he tried to buy coffee in the building lobby. "I'll pay whatever it takes," David said. That evening, sitting in his empty apartment surrounded by expensive furniture that suddenly felt suffocating, David tried to piece together how his life had fallen apart so completely in the span of 48 hours. He'd had everything: career, marriage, a beautiful daughter, a future that seemed limitless. Now he had a cardboard box of belongings, a disconnected phone line connecting him to his daughter, and the knowledge that every person who'd ever respected him now knew exactly what he'd done. His phone buzzed with an email from Natasha's attorney. A divorce petition filed in Cook County. The subject line read, "Dissolution of marriage, Bennett versus Hartwell." She wasn't even fighting for him anymore. She was fighting for her daughter. Everything else was just collateral damage. Frank Morrison's office smelled like old coffee and stale donuts. It was above a bakery in the North Shore neighborhood, the kind of place that had probably been the same for 30 years. Worn furniture, filing cabinets that stuck when you tried to open them, a window overlooking the street where people walked their dogs and bought groceries without knowing their lives were still intact. Frank himself was 58 years old, built like someone who'd worked construction before pivoting to investigations, with sharp eyes that had seen too much and wasn't impressed by any of it anymore. He wore a polo shirt with a coffee stain on the collar and didn't apologize for it. "Tell me about your wife," Frank said, pouring coffee from a pot that looked older than David. The mug he handed over was chipped but clean. David sat across from him with his hands shaking. 2 days without sleep. 2 days of watching his life implode on every social media platform. 2 days of knowing that his daughter was somewhere in the world and that he had no idea where. "Natasha is a pediatric nurse," David said, "at Northwestern Medical Center. She's methodical, organized, calm under pressure. She's the kind of person who plans things very carefully." Frank made notes in a leather notebook, his handwriting surprisingly neat. "Any history of mental illness? Drug use? Affairs?" "No," David said, and the word tasted like ash in his mouth. "She's the most stable person I know. That's what makes this so." He trailed off, unable to finish. Frank looked up. "Makes what so what? So calculated. She didn't just leave. She disappeared like she'd been planning it for months." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Had she been?" David thought about the discovery he'd made during a sleepless night, digging through old bank statements and credit card bills. A separate savings account opened 2 years ago. Regular deposits. Money accumulating month after month. Documentation of everything meticulously organized in a folder hidden in the back of their bedroom closet. "Yes," David admitted. "I think she had been." Frank made more notes. "That's not panic. That's strategy. Your wife isn't a flight risk in the traditional sense. She's not running from the law. She's running from you. There's a difference. Do you understand that difference?" David didn't answer because he wasn't sure he did. "Give me 48 hours, Frank said. "I'll see what I can find. But I'm going to be honest with you. If she planned this as carefully as it sounds like she did, she's not going to be easy to locate. She's either got help from someone who knows how to disappear people, or she's smarter than most people who run." Frank's first report came back at 11:47 p.m. Friday night. David had withdrawn $15,000 cash from a personal savings account that Natasha had opened in her maiden name 2 years earlier. An account he hadn't known existed. An account she'd been feeding money into systematically. $200 here, $300 there, never enough to trigger fraud alerts, but enough that it added up. Over 24 months, she'd accumulated $47,000. She'd liquidated another investment account, $32,000 in securities, 3 days after discovering his texts. That money had disappeared into a wire transfer with no obvious trail. South Station bus terminal security footage showed a woman matching Natasha's description at 8 a.m. Monday morning, just hours after he'd come home to find them gone. She'd been wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap. She'd purchased a ticket to Portland, Maine, but when the Portland bus began boarding, she'd walked right past it. Security cameras followed her to a side exit where a silver Honda Accord was waiting, license plate obscured by mud. She used the bus ticket as a decoy, Frank explained over the phone. Misdirection. Amateur investigators would have stopped there. But I ran facial recognition on every camera angle. She got in that Honda at 9:04 a.m. and headed north on I-95. Where's she going? David asked. Working on it. But the car is registered to a Thomas Morrison, 63 years old, retired family law attorney living in Kennebunkport, Maine. Ring any bells? David's stomach dropped. Thomas Morrison. Natasha's godfather. The man who'd given a toast at their wedding about how he'd known Natasha since she was born. The distinguished older gentleman with silver hair who'd sat in the back of the church and smiled like he was proud of her. He's her godfather, David said quietly. Well, that complicates things, Frank said. Your wife doesn't just have $47,000 in cash. She has access to someone who knows family law inside and out. Someone who has connections with judges, attorneys, court officials. If he's helping her, she's not just running scared. She's building a case. That's when David knew he needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. The best lawyer. The kind of attorney who understood that this wasn't about finding his wife anymore. This was about custody. This was about war. He found Diane Carew through desperate searching on legal forums and attorney review sites. Diane Carew, 64 years old, steel gray hair, eyes like a shark. Never lost a custody case in 40 years of practice. Her office was on the 42nd floor of a glass tower that seemed designed to intimidate, with a view that cost extra and a receptionist who looked like she'd been selected for her ability to make people feel uncomfortable. The retainer agreement required a $50,000 deposit. Non-refundable. Diane charged $950 per hour with a minimum of 3 hours per week billing. This case will easily run 200 hours before trial, Diane said, her voice clipped and professional. Possibly more. You're looking at $200,000 minimum. Possibly double that. Can you afford it? David thought about his maxed-out credit cards. His nearly empty bank accounts. The severance package from Harrison and Associates that had been precisely calculated to sting. He thought about his parents' refusal to help. He thought about the brownstone. The beautiful, expensive, meaningless brownstone that was the only asset he had left. I'll mortgage the apartment, he said. Diane's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Respect, maybe. Or recognition of desperation. Smart man. We're going to need capital for this fight. Diane filed the response to Natasha's petition on Monday afternoon. A counterpetition requesting joint legal custody and 50-50 physical custody. An emergency motion for temporary custody arrangements. A request for psychological evaluations for both parties, arguing that if Natasha's mental fitness was being questioned, David's should be evaluated too. We need to muddy the waters, Diane explained. Your wife has a sympathetic narrative right now. Woman abandoned during medical emergency. Baby hospitalized. You were unreachable. It plays well in court. But narratives can be reframed. Your wife fled the state with a minor child without notification. That's parental alienation. She disconnected all communication. That's concerning behavior. It suggests instability, possibly postpartum mental health issues. We document this. We build a counter-narrative. But none of that is true, David protested weakly. Diane looked at him like he'd just said something spectacularly naive. Mr. Hartwell, I'm not interested in what's true. I'm interested in what I can prove and what will convince a judge. Do you want custody of your daughter, or do you want to feel good about yourself? David didn't answer because he already knew the price of honesty. The first hearing was scheduled for September 15th in Cook County Family Court. Judge Marcus Thompson presiding, a man in his mid-60s with a reputation for being tough but fair. Diane spent 2 weeks preparing David for testimony. How to sit, how to dress, what to say and what not to say. She enrolled him in parenting classes at a community center. She connected him with a therapist, not because she thought he needed one, but because documentation of seeking help would look good to the court. Your wife is probably doing the same thing, Diane said. Building a counter-narrative. Getting her own attorneys. Probably in Maine, which means the case might transfer there once a venue is established. Family law in Maine is more mother-friendly. That's a problem we need to address. Frank Morrison reported that Natasha had indeed hired an attorney. A woman named Patricia Sinclair, one of the best divorce attorneys in Maine. She'd been recommended by Thomas Morrison and had taken the case pro bono, suggesting that either Thomas was paying her or that she understood this case was high-profile enough to be worth the investment. Your wife is being represented by someone very good, Frank said. Someone who knows the system. Someone who has connections. This isn't going to be easy. David realized, sitting in Diane's office the week before the hearing, that his wife had outmaneuvered him completely. While he'd been at luxury hotels and expensive dinners, Natasha had been planning. While he'd been turning off his phone, she'd been documenting. While he'd been building a case against her, she'd been building a better case against him. The truth was, and this truth arrived with the force of a physical blow, Natasha had been smarter than him from the beginning. More strategic. More willing to play the long game. He'd thought he was winning. He'd thought the affair was his secret. He'd thought the documentation would give him leverage. But Natasha had been playing chess while he'd been playing checkers. And now she was about to demonstrate exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. The first supervised visitation was scheduled for Saturday, September 18th at 10 a.m. at the Child Development Center in downtown Chicago. A facility specifically designed for court-ordered supervised visits. Bright walls. Age-appropriate toys. Cameras in every corner. David arrived at 9:45 a.m. wearing the outfit Diane had selected for him. Business casual. Pressed khakis. A button-down shirt that suggested stability without being too formal. His hair was combed. His shoes were polished. He looked like a man who was making an effort. Diane had drilled punctuality into him over the past 3 weeks. Show them you're reliable, she'd said. Show them you care. Every detail matters. The supervisor was a woman named Sandra Ellis, mid-40s with kind eyes that had probably witnessed hundreds of broken families pass through these rooms. She greeted David with a clipboard and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mr. Hartwell, I'm Sandra. I'll be supervising your visits with Amelia going forward. I'm looking for appropriate care, safety, engagement with the child. If at any point I feel Amelia is in distress or you're behaving inappropriately, I'll end the visit. Do you understand? I understand, David said. The wait for Natasha to arrive was interminable. David sat on a small chair designed for a child's frame and tried to steady his breathing. He hadn't seen his daughter in 3 weeks. 3 weeks that in infant time was an eternity. Amelia would be almost 11 weeks old now. She'd grown, changed, forgotten him. The door opened. Natasha walked in carrying a baby that David barely recognized. Amelia was bigger. Her face had filled out. Her eyes tracked movement with alert awareness. She looked healthy, thriving. Nothing like the fevered, struggling infant he'd last seen in a hospital bed. But it was Natasha who made David's breath catch. She'd cut her hair into a sharp, professional bob that framed her face. She wore a navy suit that screamed competence and motherhood. Her makeup was flawless. She looked like a completely different woman than the exhausted, desperate creature he'd left behind. She looked like she'd won something. Natasha handed Amelia to Sandra without looking at David. "Mom will be back at 4 p.m., she said to the baby in a bright voice. She turned and left without a word to David. Without eye contact. Without acknowledging that the man in the room was the father of her child. Sandra transferred Amelia carefully into David's arms. "You're going to spend the day with your dad," she said in that bright, forced voice adults used with babies. Amelia looked at David with solemn dark eyes and began to cry. The visit was a disaster. Owen, wait. Amelia. Always Amelia. David kept mixing up the names in his head, a sign of how little present he'd actually been. Amelia cried for the first 40 minutes. David tried everything. Bouncing. Rocking. The songs he half remembered from his childhood. Sandra kept making notes on her clipboard. "That's normal," Sandra said gently. "Stranger anxiety starts around this age. Just hold her gently and talk to her softly. She'll settle." Eventually, Amelia did settle. By hour 3, she was playing with toys, looking at picture books, occasionally making eye contact with David. By hour 5, she laughed at one of his silly faces. That laugh was the best thing David had experienced in weeks. Sandra's notes at pickup reflected his effort. Father demonstrates patience and appropriate engagement. Child settles after initial distress. Interaction appears positive and age-appropriate. Week 2. Amelia cried again when David arrived, but less intensely. By the end of the 6-hour visit, she seemed comfortable. Sandra's notes were similarly positive. Week 3, David noticed something. Amelia was fussier than she had been the previous week. She wouldn't finish her bottles. She seemed unsettled despite his best efforts to soothe her. Sandra made notes. Child exhibits some distress during visit. Father attempts appropriate soothing techniques, but child remains somewhat fussy. Week 4. The distress continued. Week 5, it intensified. By week 6, Amelia was crying inconsolably through entire visits. She wouldn't eat. She wouldn't settle. She looked uncomfortable in a way that David couldn't identify or fix. Sandra's notes were becoming increasingly concerning. Child frequently cries during father's visits. Father seems to have difficulty soothing infant. Child calms significantly once returned to mother. David didn't understand what was happening. He was doing everything right. He was showing up early. He was engaging. He was patient. He was following Sandra's suggestions. But Amelia seemed to actively dislike being with him. What David didn't know was that those bottles, the bottles prepared by Natasha and brought to every visit in the diaper bag, contained slightly less formula than the recommended amounts. Not so little that it would harm Amelia. Not so little that anyone checking would notice. Just enough that the baby would be a little bit hungry, a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit more likely to cry and be unsettled. The instructions had come from Diane Carew during a private conversation with Natasha's attorney, Patricia Sinclair. Not directly suggested, lawyers were careful about those things. But carefully implied, through discussion of documentation strategies and the importance of demonstrating comfort levels in parental presence. Patricia had then passed along the suggestion to Natasha using the kind of coded language that kept everyone's hands technically clean. Consider, Patricia had said carefully, whether certain variables in the visitation environment might be adjusted to establish clearer patterns for documentation purposes. Natasha had understood immediately. She also understood that she would go to hell before she'd do it. Instead, she'd arranged for her mother to bring the bottles and to deliberately prepare them with less formula, so that Natasha herself couldn't be accused of tampering, so that if anyone investigated, the evidence would point away from her. By week 8, there was a CPS investigation. An anonymous report about inadequate nutrition during paternal visitation. Sarah Williams, a caseworker with 15 years of experience, showed up at David's apartment to evaluate his living situation. She found nothing wrong. The apartment was clean. He had formula. He had appropriate furniture. He had books and toys. But Sarah had Dr. Patel's notes about mild dehydration from the NICU stay. She had Sandra's documentation of Amelia's crying. She had a pattern that looked concerning on paper. "I'm not finding intentional neglect," Sarah concluded after her investigation. "But the pattern is troubling. I'd recommend monitoring future visits." Diane was pleased when David called her. "This proves Claire is engaging in parental alienation," Diane said, mixing up the names in a way that made David's skin crawl. "She's filing false reports to make you look bad. We can use this in court. It shows her willingness to manipulate the system." But David wasn't sure it felt false. Amelia really did seem unhappy with him. Really did cry during visits. Really did seem to settle more easily with Natasha. What if he actually was a bad father? The question haunted him. But there wasn't time to explore it because the custody hearing was approaching. Because Diane had other strategies to implement. She'd obtained Natasha's private journal through Thomas Morrison, who'd been convinced to provide it in exchange for a $75,000 loan that Ryan, David, his name was David, had offered to his struggling father-in-law's wife's medical treatments. Margaret had cancer. The treatments cost $10,000 a month. Diane had simply connected those dots. The journal contained Natasha's worst thoughts, her darkest fears, her most desperate hopes, written late at night when she couldn't sleep. Thoughts about wanting to run. Thoughts about wanting to disappear with Amelia. Thoughts about never letting David see their daughter again. None of it was an actual plan. All of it was fear processing. But Diane knew how to present fear as intent. "This is a flight risk," Diane told David. "This shows she's been planning an escape. A judge will see this and understand that she's unpredictable. Potentially dangerous." "How did you get this?" David asked, suddenly aware that they'd crossed a line somewhere. "A concerned party provided it," Diane said smoothly. "It's not illegal if someone voluntarily shares something." But it felt illegal. It felt wrong. It felt like they were building their case on top of Natasha's most vulnerable moments, the thoughts she'd written in the middle of the night when she was terrified and alone. Yet David didn't protest. He let Diane use the journal. He let her file motions based on Natasha's private fears. He let himself become the kind of person who weaponized desperation. The judge's response was swift. GPS monitoring for Natasha. Passport surrendered. No leaving Cook County without court permission. She was marked like a criminal for thoughts she'd written in private. That evening, watching the news report about Natasha's ankle monitor, David felt something inside him shift. This wasn't justice. This was cruelty dressed up in legal language. But by then, he was already so deep in the game that stopping felt impossible. The overnight visitation was scheduled for October 3rd through October 4th. David's first extended time with Amelia since Natasha had disappeared. 48 hours where he would be solely responsible for his daughter. Diane had insisted on it. "We need to demonstrate that you can parent independently," Diane had said. "That you're capable and competent. The visits need to go perfectly. Document everything. Show the judge you've changed." David had prepared meticulously. He'd converted his second bedroom into a nursery with a portable crib and all the supplies he might need. Diapers. formula, clean clothes, toys, everything organized and accessible. He'd taken additional parenting classes. He'd read the books. He'd watched the videos. He was ready. Or he thought he was. The handoff happened at the Family Connection Center at 4 p.m. Friday afternoon. Natasha looked exhausted. Her professional armor had cracked slightly. David could see the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she buckled Amelia into his car seat. Her schedule is in the diaper bag, Natasha said quietly. She eats at 6. She naps at 7. She usually wakes around 9 for a bottle. She sleeps through until about 6 a.m. I know, David said. We've been practicing. But the thing was, practicing with Sandra watching and documenting was very different than doing it alone. The evening went fine. Amelia ate. She napped. She seemed content. But at 1:47 a.m., she woke up screaming. Not the normal fussiness of a baby needing to eat. Actual screaming. The kind of screaming that suggested pain or distress. David checked her diaper, wet but not soaked. He offered a bottle. She refused it aggressively, pushing it away and continuing to scream. He tried rocking her, walking her, singing to her. Nothing worked. Her temperature felt elevated. David found the thermometer and checked. 102.3 degrees. His daughter had a fever and he was alone, and suddenly all the preparation in the world felt worthless. All the parenting classes and the videos and the books meant nothing when faced with a screaming infant in the middle of the night. He called Natasha at 2 a.m. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been awake, waiting for him to fail. Amelia has a fever, David said, trying to keep his voice steady. It's 102.3. She won't eat. She just keeps screaming. Did you check her diaper? Natasha's voice was clinical. Yes. Wait. He checked again. This time, there was a small dark spot in her diaper. There's a little stool, but it's not diarrhea. Did you take her temperature correctly? Under the arm and held still. Yes. 102.3. There was a pause. A very long pause. Then Natasha said, take her to the emergency room. Any fever over 100.4 in an infant under 12 weeks is considered serious. Should I call you when? Just go, she said, and hung up. The emergency room at Northwestern Memorial was quieter at 2:30 a.m. than it had been during Natasha's crisis. But the doctor on call, an older man named Dr. Patel, no relation to the OB, just a coincidence that the ER was crowded with Patels, took one look at Amelia and ordered immediate testing. Fever in a 7-week-old without obvious source is concerning, Dr. Patel explained. We're going to run some labs. Possibly a urine culture. Blood work to check for infection. The urine culture required a catheterization. David listened to his daughter scream during the procedure and felt his heart shatter in real time. He'd thought experiencing Natasha's voicemail messages about the spinal tap had been the worst thing he could feel. But hearing his own daughter in pain, knowing he was responsible for her being alone in this hospital bed, it was worse. So much worse. The test results came back in 3 hours. She has a urinary tract infection, Dr. Patel said. Not uncommon in infants, and very treatable with antibiotics. We'll start her on 4 antibiotics. She'll need to stay overnight for observation, but she should be fine. David held Amelia's hand while the 4 was placed. He watched her tiny face contort in pain and tried not to cry. He'd been so focused on winning, on proving himself as a father, on building a case against Natasha, that he'd completely missed the actual work of fatherhood. He called Natasha at 6 a.m. She had a UTI, he said. They're treating her with antibiotics. She needs to stay overnight. I'm coming to the hospital, Natasha said. You don't have to. I've got her. David. His name. spoken with an exhaustion that suggested she'd been awake all night worrying. She needs me. She's scared. She's in pain. She needs her mother. I'm coming. She arrived at the hospital at 7:15 a.m. She was wearing the same clothes from yesterday. Her professional armor was completely gone. She looked like what she was, a frightened mother worried about her sick daughter. She took one look at Amelia and started crying. "Hey, baby," she whispered, carefully taking Amelia's hand to avoid disturbing the four. "Mommy's here. You're going to be okay." And David watched his wife, the woman he'd betrayed, the woman he'd manipulated, the woman he'd tried to destroy, comfort their daughter with a tenderness and presence that David suddenly understood he'd never been capable of. Natasha stayed for 4 hours. Then she said she needed to go home and sleep. She stood up to leave, and David found himself standing up too.
"Natasha," he said, and his voice cracked. "I'm sorry."
She stopped. She turned to look at him with eyes that had seen too much. Eyes that had learned not to expect anything from him.
"I'm sorry," he repeated.
"For all of it. The affair. The plan. The texts. The way I turned off my phone when you needed me.
All of it."
I know," she said quietly. "I've been lying to you. To the court. To myself. I've been playing a game, and I've been so focused on winning that I lost sight of what matters." "Amelia," Natasha said. "Yes, Amelia. Our daughter. Not a chess piece. Not a weapon. Not collateral damage in my custody battle." Natasha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The formula in the bottles during your visits. Did you know?" David's stomach dropped. "What?" "The bottles. They had less formula than recommended. It was intentional. It was supposed to make Amelia fussy during your visits so it would look like you couldn't soothe her." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need you to understand what I've become. What this fight has turned me into. I've done terrible things, David. Not as terrible as what you've done, but terrible nonetheless. I've weaponized our daughter. I've used her as evidence.
And I can't do it anymore."
"What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm done fighting. Not because I forgive you. Not because I think you deserve another chance. But because Amelia deserves a father. And she deserves for that father to be present and real and not performing for a judge." David felt tears streaming down his face. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to drop the custody fight. I want you to stop trying to prove something. I want you to actually be a father to your daughter instead of just trying to win." That afternoon, David called Diane Carew. "I'm dropping the custody petition," he said. There was a pause. Then Diane said, "You're what?" "I'm dropping it. I'm offering Natasha primary custody. I'm offering to pay child support. I'm ending this. You're making a mistake. We were building a strong case. We had documentation. We had a beautiful daughter who needs her mother," David interrupted. "And a wife who I've hurt enough. I'm done." He didn't wait for Diane's response. He hung up and called Patricia Sinclair's office. He asked to speak with Natasha's attorney. When Patricia came on the line, he said, "I want to negotiate an agreement. Primary custody to Natasha. Supervised visitation building to unsupervised. Whatever she wants. I'm done fighting." There was surprise in Patricia's voice. "Are you sure about this?" "No," David said. "But I'm sure about stopping." 6 months passed like water finding its level. The custody agreement was finalized in November. Primary physical custody to Natasha. David paid $5,200 per month in child support. He'd agreed to supervised visitation building to unsupervised over a period of 6 months. No appeals. No counter petitions. No fighting. Natasha had returned to work at Northwestern Medical Center part-time. She'd moved out of the brownstone apartment in Pilsen and into a small cottage in Evanston, just north of Chicago. The cottage had a small backyard where Amelia could eventually play. It had hardwood floors and a kitchen that didn't cost $75,000 to renovate. It was modest and real and entirely Natasha's. She was dating someone. A high school history teacher named James who was kind and patient and took things slowly. He'd met Amelia twice. He didn't push. He was just there, consistent in a way that seemed foreign to relationships but also felt like exactly what Natasha needed. David had moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a less expensive part of Chicago. He'd let the brownstone go. He'd sold his Porsche and bought a used Honda. He'd taken a job at a smaller investment firm for significantly less money. The work was honest and straightforward. There were no $300 million deals. No prestige. No status. But he left at 5:30 p.m. every day to make Amelia's visitation appointments. The supervised visits ended in March. By April, David had unsupervised custody one evening a week and every other Saturday. He'd learned Amelia's schedule, her preferences, her personality. She was almost 1 year old now, walking confidently, learning new words daily. She was stubborn and joyful and endlessly curious. She was his daughter, and he was learning what it meant to actually be her father instead of just trying to win her. Amelia's first birthday party was held on a Sunday afternoon in early May at a park in Evanston. The weather was perfect, the kind of late spring day that made you grateful to be alive. Natasha had organized it with James's help. There were balloons. There was a cake shaped like a butterfly because Amelia had become obsessed with insects. There were maybe 30 people there. Family, friends, colleagues from the hospital. David arrived early. He brought the diaper bag he'd packed and a gift he'd chosen himself, a set of soft books about animals. He was nervous. He was always nervous now, but it was a different kind of nervous. Not the nervous of a man worried about being judged by a court. The nervous of a man who cared deeply about being present for his daughter and was terrified of messing it up. Natasha's mother, Carol, greeted him with a smile that was cautious but genuine. Natasha's sister Rebecca was there, warmer than she'd been in months but still protective of her sister. James was there, helping set up games. He shook David's hand without any obvious resentment. Just acknowledgement that they were both part of Amelia's life now. Natasha was arranging the birthday decorations when she saw David. She was wearing a simple yellow sundress and had her hair down. She looked happy. Actually happy, not the performing happiness for court, kind of happy. "You came early," she said. "I wanted to help if you needed it." She nodded toward the balloon arch that wasn't quite stable. "That thing keeps tipping over. Maybe you're stronger than I am." They worked together to secure the balloon arch. Not friends, not yet, but allies united by love for their daughter. They talked about Amelia, about her development, about the funny things she'd said, about her new habit of clapping whenever she accomplished something. "She got that from you," Natasha said. "The pride in small accomplishments. You always celebrated wins, even when they were tiny." "I celebrated them professionally," David said quietly. "I celebrated closing deals and making money. I didn't celebrate the things that actually mattered." "You're celebrating them now," Natasha said. "That has to count for something." The party was joyful chaos. Amelia smashed her cake with surprising enthusiasm, more interested in the texture than the taste. She opened presents, mostly ignoring the gifts themselves in favor of the wrapping paper. She played with other children her age, though mostly she just watched them with solemn fascination. When the time came for the birthday song, Amelia was held by Natasha while everyone sang. She looked confused by the attention but delighted by her mother's joy. David stood beside them, filming on his phone, capturing the moment not for evidence or documentation, but simply because it mattered. Because his daughter was turning 1. Because she was alive and healthy and surrounded by people who loved her. After the party wound down and guests began leaving, David helped Natasha pack things into her car. James was inside, putting Amelia down for a nap. The two of them worked in companionable silence, folding tablecloths, collecting plates, disposing of leftover cake. "I've been thinking about something," David said as they loaded the final items. "Okay," Natasha said, waiting. "I want to continue therapy. Not for the court. Not for appearances. But for real. I want to understand why I made the choices I made. Why I thought the deal mattered more than my family.
Why I was willing to hurt you to win."
"Good," Natasha said. "That's good, David. I don't expect forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But I want to be the kind of man that Amelia can be proud of someday. Not because the court is watching, but because I actually want to be that man." Natasha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been in therapy too. Working through my own stuff. The anger. The fear. The way I weaponized Amelia to protect myself. I did terrible things too, David."
"Not as terrible as what you did, but terrible nonetheless. You were protecting your daughter."
"I was protecting myself and calling it protection of Amelia. That's different. It took a therapist to help me see that." She paused, then said, "I don't hate you anymore. I thought I would forever, but I don't. I'm still angry. I still think you made choices that hurt us both deeply. But I don't hate you. And maybe someday, Amelia won't hate you either. Maybe she won't even remember the worst of it." "Is there any chance?" David started, then stopped himself. "No," Natasha said gently. "There's no chance for us. What we had was broken by betrayal. That doesn't fix. But there's a chance for co-parenting. A real chance. And that has to be enough." David nodded. He understood. The marriage was gone. The love had been replaced by something more complicated. But what was emerging was something that might actually work. Two people committed to raising their daughter, not because they were legally required to, but because they both loved Amelia more than they hated each other. That night, alone in his modest apartment, David looked at the photos he'd taken during Amelia's birthday party. His daughter laughing. His daughter covered in cake. His daughter surrounded by people who loved her. He thought about the man he'd been a year ago, the man in the expensive suits chasing deals that would never be enough. The man who'd turned off his phone during a medical emergency. The man who'd tried to take his daughter away from her mother. He didn't recognize that man anymore. He wasn't sure if that meant he'd changed or if he'd just finally seen himself clearly for the first time. Either way, he was committed to being different. Not for the court. Not for Natasha. Not for anyone but Amelia. Because his daughter deserved a father who showed up. A father who was present. A father who understood that some things couldn't be measured in dollars or won in court. Some things, like love, like family, like the privilege of watching your child grow, could only be earned through consistency and honesty and the willingness to do the actual work of being human. 1 year later, Amelia's second birthday party was bigger. She was walking confidently now, talking in short sentences, expressing opinions about everything from what she wore to what she ate. She was a person, fully formed, with a personality that had nothing to do with the custody battle that had preceded her existence. The party was held at the same park. The guest list was longer. Natasha brought James, who'd become a regular fixture in their lives. David brought a woman named Sarah, someone he'd met in therapy group, someone who was also rebuilding her life after trauma. They weren't serious, but they were learning how to be present to each other. Amelia blew out her candles with James's help. She opened presents with the single-minded focus of a toddler. She played with other children. She laughed at her father's silly faces and her mother's songs. Looking at his daughter surrounded by people who loved her, surrounded by the wreckage of the life David had nearly destroyed and the rebuilt life that had risen from those ashes, David understood something fundamental. The happy ending wasn't getting the girl. Wasn't winning the custody battle. Wasn't proving himself right and Natasha wrong. The happy ending was this. His daughter alive and healthy and thriving. Her mother finding peace and building a new life. His own slow, painful journey toward becoming someone worth knowing. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and complicated and involved more than one person learning to live with regret. But it was real. And after everything they'd been through, real was enough. That night, after the party ended and James had driven Natasha and Amelia back to their cottage, after David had returned to his modest apartment and changed out of his clothes, he sat by his window and watched the city lights. He thought about the woman who'd once been his wife, about the man he'd once been, about the daughter who was growing up in the spaces between their mistakes and their efforts to do better. He thought about redemption, and whether it was even possible for someone who'd done what he'd done. And he decided that it didn't matter whether he deserved redemption. What mattered was that he kept trying, kept showing up, kept being present, kept doing the work of becoming a man his daughter could respect. That was enough. It would have to be enough. Because some second chances aren't about getting everything back. They're about learning to live with what you've lost and building something real from the fragments that remain. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.